This is going to be our first video for 1022 and 1023. We're picking up here with the reform and looking at, we just finished public asylums, we're going to go into public education now. Okay, so middle class were motivated by fear of the future with growing number of uneducated people who would be ignorant or not educated and so forth, and we have a lot of immigration this time period. Also a lot of growing just, lower class income people. And without education, a lot of people middle class and up worry that there might be problems for America if we don't fix this. And it wasn't just about immigrant children, it was also about native born too. So you start to see the idea of tax supported schools, or what public schools eventually do become, where states would provide funding through taxes to provide public schooling. Horace Mann in Massachusetts was one of the first people to get a state to pass a tax and to create public schools for everybody, and it was completely free. But it was also compulsory, which means that you had to go. Free meaning, that. And again, when I say compulsory, I mean like it was only about 1st to 5th grade at best. I mean, back in those days, you didn't have to go until high school age, so it was very small amount of years you had to actually go to school, but you had to get something. You had to get the basic reading, writing, math, those kind of things. And Massachusetts, under Horace Mann, Mann spelled M-A-N-N, was one of the first places to do that in the 1830s, I believe. More education was also pushed inside of the schoolhouse, not just the basics. You also had to learn to be on time, be punctual. You had to learn hard work, because essentially they're also trying to get you ready for your life, for the workforce. And especially in this time of industrialization, they want you to be able to go out from out from school, and be ready one day to take on a real job. Also, sobriety being another thing they taught in school too. The Second Great Awakening also helped fuel the growth of private colleges in this time period. You have private colleges set up by Protestant groups in Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Iowa, all in this time period. So not state colleges, but private colleges were also expanded on this time period, like Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, and Iowa, as a result of the Second Great Awakening and the desire for more education to be out there, more, so everybody doesn't have to go to Harvard or somewhere like that, Yale, Princeton, one of those schools. There's more colleges people can attend and be educated. You also see some of the first women accepted into colleges. Mount Holyoke in Massachusetts, Holyoke spelled Holyoke, and Oberlin College, Oberin. So Mount Holyoke and Oberlin College being in Ohio, began to admit women as well. So you also see some of the first women. Now, in no way do a lot of women go to college in this time period. There are women who are going to college, but it's not normal. A very small percentage of women are actually attending college, and that only comes from families who would believe in the idea of like women equality and so forth. So public education has become more of a big thing, especially up north. You're not seeing as much public education emphasis in the South, but you're starting to see the first compulsory, mandatory schools for young children up in the north around the 1830s, 1840s time frame. All right. Next issue is changing American family and women's rights movement. So most Americans still lived in rural areas in the 1830s and 40s, but profound changes were happening to the family in industrial cities. So rural areas pretty much stay the same, throughout this time period up through the Civil War. But if you live in a city, the family structure is beginning to change here. Men left home to work for salaries as opposed to work on a farm, and they worked for 6 days or so a week. Middle class women typically stayed at home with children. Now this is middle class women, because the man could afford for the housewife to stay at home. So upper class women would be able to stay home all the time. If you're a low income family, your husband low income, the wife worked. But for middle class folks, as that class of people grow, you have a lot of these middle class women who are able to stay home. Fewer children were had now as a result. So on the farms, you would have multiple children to survive childbirth. Also to help you on the farm, you want to have 8 kids because you want to have that many farm hands. But now, if you live in a city, you only want to have 1 or 2 because you don't want that many mouths to feed. Plus, even if you are middle class or whatever, you don't want to have that many kids because, again, you just don't have the space and room you do like in rural areas either. Also, the most affluent women, the richest women, now had leisure time for moral and religious organizations too. So upper middle class and upper class women who don't do anything, maybe have nannies take care of their kids and so forth, can now have time to join religious organizations or join other volunteer organizations like reform-minded organizations. So they might get involved with temperance, they might get involved with other type of reform movements, abolition, whatever the case is too. So this allows women to break away from having to work or take care of kids and getting more involved in society. So you begin to see changes, especially for women, as far as what their role in society is becoming and how they're getting more involved, not just staying at home all the time. This creates what's called the cult of domesticity, and it's right here, cult of domesticity. I can't spell that. I'll kind of zoom in here a little bit so you can see that a little better. Cult of domesticity. So what that means, it's these defined gender roles for the middle class. Now this doesn't affect the lower class because they can't do this because they can't afford it. But the cult of domesticity is where you have these more traditional defined gender roles that become very, very commonplace for the man and wife of the house. Men were the dealt with economic and political affairs. They were the breadwinners. They worked all day, came home. They took care of all political affairs. They voted. They took care of everything economic, the property, the buying, all that stuff. Women took care of the children in the home. That was their job. So the idea was that after the husband has a hard day of work, 5-6 days a week, he comes home and the wife is there to take care of him. It's like she's supposed to provide this welcoming nest for the family. He has to deal with all the real life toils and troubles of society, where she takes care of the house, takes care of the kids, but the house should be kind of a refuge for the husband from the weary world around him. So this idea creates a very idealized woman who can be the housewife, can be the house mother, and she's also the house's moral leader. Setting the standards as far as how everybody should believe and so forth with religion and so on. She's also the educator. She's in charge of making sure the kids get education. If not herself, maybe a nanny does it or some kind of instructor. But this again, the cult of domesticity is only happening in cities where you have middle class women developing around industrialization because they can afford to do so. You might see with some of this with upper class, but all the lower class not doing it. If you're living in a rural farm area, you're not doing that either. So this was a result of industrialization, but it's only happening in those industrialized areas. With increased changing role of women this time period, you then get the beginnings of the women's rights movement too. So in the 1830s and 40s, when you begin to see the earliest inklings of a women's rights movement, women reformers resented their secondary roles in movements and couldn't fully participate in policy discussions. So you have women join temperance societies or join abolition societies, and they were treated not as leaders. They would be the ones hitting this stuff the hardest, but then they would be asked to step aside for leadership for a male, or they couldn't really be the outright leaders of a group. So they're already treated kind of secondary in spite of the fact that they were some of the most ardent reformers in this time period. So two women who were reformers took it upon themselves to try to challenge women in gender roles at the time. Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who you see down here. So you have Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton down here. Both women worked towards trying to improve women's rights this time period. They campaigned for women's rights after being prevented to speak at an anti-slavery convention. So that's what sparked it. They weren't allowed to speak at an anti-slavery convention, abolition meeting, because they're women. And that then led to them eventually going on to try to hold rallies for women's rights. Their most important rally, the one they both formed together, is at Seneca Falls in New York in 1848. So the Seneca Falls Convention was the first women's rights convention in American history. So it's a big deal. The first time you have people getting together for the sole purpose of promoting women's rights and women's equality. And so Mott and Stanton, both leading feminists at the time, met with other feminists to discuss these issues. They developed a document here called the Declaration of Sentiments, which you read part of in your documents. So basically, if you read the Declaration of Sentiments, it looks exactly like what? What document? Should be pretty obvious. Declaration of Independence. except they pretty much just took the exact same document and then just added men and women to every time it mentioned men. So they create this document called the Declaration of Rights and Sentiments. I'm sorry, Declaration of Sentiments, excuse me, that declared all men and women are equal. Mott and Stanton then led a campaign for equal voting, legal, and property rights too. So they also lead a campaign for equal voting, legal, and property rights as well. So women's rights campaigns begin to get some steam, but it will become secondary to slavery in the Civil War in the 50s. So as it gets steam in the late 40s, it will decline by the late 50s and won't pick up steam again until the 1870s, pretty much after the war ends. But it's important to know that convention. It's important to know those two ladies, and it's important to know that document, the Declaration of Sentiments, that comes out of it too. In fact, Frederick Douglass actually spoke at that convention too, about supporting women's rights and so forth as well. And you can see a picture of the two ladies here, and also a picture of one of the women speaking at the convention. All right. So now we get to abolition and anti-slavery, which is what a lot of the things you read about in those documents this past week, and we're going to discuss some of this on Monday when we come back. So we're looking at the anti-slavery movement. Anti-slavery movement, not everybody was on the same page. Some people wanted, some people were moderate, some people were radical. Some people wanted slavery to stop expanding. Some people wanted slavery to be gone forever. Some people wanted to see the Southerners paid for their lost slave property. Some people felt like they should, go to trial. It was a wide range. Not every single anti-slave person was cut the same way. So there was a wide range from moderate folks to people who supported gradual emancipation to radicals who wanted immediate emancipation and no compensation to the slave masters. The Second Great Awakening encouraged a lot of Northerners to see slavery as a sin. Because remember that slavery was still going on in the 18 teens up north in low capacities, but it was still happening. 18 teens, early 20s, slavery is still around. But when the Second Great Awakening comes along, it makes people much more passionate about thinking of slavery as a sin, and thus it fuels a fire for abolition. So by the 1830s, abolition becomes a much more prominent thing, and that's why you don't see it beforehand back when the country first started. So people had different reactions to this once they kind of, start thinking of slavery as being this, very immoral thing. So first we'll look at the American Colonization Society. The American Colonization Society had the idea of transporting freed slaves to Africa in 1817. So the idea of the American Colonization Society, which formed, became an actual thing, they said, let's take freed slaves and move them to Africa. That way we basically just get the problem out of here. Like we just remove African Americans out of America, and hopefully they'll just remove the problem completely. It starts in 1817. Large amounts of whites thought this was a great solution. And by 1822, the ACS had established an African American settlement in Africa in a country they developed called Liberia, which is still around. So Liberia is actually created by America, essentially, as a place for these ex-slaves, these free slaves, to go to and make their own country. In fact, their first settlement is called Monrovia, and you can probably figure out why. This is in 1822. So who's president at the time? James Monroe, right? So Monrovia, Liberia, is a settlement that results from the American Colonization Society. This was never very practical. Because in this time frame, you see slavery go from 1.5 million slaves in America in 1820 to 4 million by 1860. So slavery in no way had a dent put in it by the American Colonization Society. And by the 1860s, only 12,000 ex-slaves actually went there. So only 12,000 ex-slaves actually went to Liberia as a result. So while some people thought it was a good idea, wasn't practical and didn't really make a dramatic change. And slavery only got bigger and bigger because of things like the cotton trade and so forth. All right, we'll do one more and then I'll take a break from this video. The next one's going to be William Lloyd Garrison. The next topic's going to be William Lloyd Garrison, this guy right here on this picture. And also you can see Monrovia. Well, you can see down Monrovia. You see where Liberia is. Kind of zoom in here a little bit. You can see where Liberia is there, Monrovia. Then you can see William Lloyd Garrison, his paper there, The Liberator, right next to him too. All right, so in 1831, William Lloyd Garrison, who's this white man from the North, began an abolitionist newspaper called The Liberator. So he begins this abolitionist newspaper called The Liberator. He was an extremist radical when it came to abolition. he is considered to be like the radical abolitionist. He wanted emancipation now. He wanted zero compensation for the slave masters, and he wanted these people to be free. He advocated for immediate abolition without compensation. He actually burned the U.S. Constitution in a demonstration one day because it's a pro-slavery document, which is very true. I mean, the Constitution itself does defend slavery. So he was very radical, very extreme in his viewpoints, and he published his newspaper often expressing his views and explaining why abolition needed to happen, why slavery needed to go away. In the 1840s, people who followed Garrison actually formed a political party called the Liberty Party. Some Northerners believed political action was more necessary or better than Garrison's moral crusade. So even some people who followed Garrison thought that while he has good ideas, there should be something stronger to take place here, and they need to take political action. So in the 1830s, you get a new third party called the Liberty Party, who had one platform, and I bet you can't guess what it is. Liberation of slaves. So they actually ran a candidate for president in 1840, 1844 on the sole issue of freeing slavery, or stopping slavery. And their pledge was to end slavery by any political and legal means necessary. So that's becoming more and more of an issue now. So you see radicals like Garrison in his paper, The Liberator, and you see this third party develop all in this time period to try to challenge the norms of this time period. So we'll stop there for our first video.